and welcome. This story has prompted so many theories and raging debates in online forums, and I do have to note that this particular case does discuss some topics that some of you might find distressing. So if you're watching or listening, please make sure to take care of yourself. Today, we're diving into the strange disappearance of Joan Risch. I'm Fiona, and this is Case Continued. Joan Carolyn Risch was born on the 12th of May 1930 in Brooklyn, New York. Her early years were marked by a tragedy that would actually shape the rest of her life. When she was just 9 years old, her family moved to Mountain Lakes, New Jersey. Not long after, while Joan was away visiting relatives back in Brooklyn, her parents, Harold and Josephine, died in a house fire, one that authorities would later describe as suspicious. Both were found dead of smoke inhalation, and Harold was actually found on the ground with the phone receiver still in his hand. This led investigators to believe that he actually died while he was trying to call for help. Josephine, who was dressed in a robe, was found on the couch, and investigators believe that she had fallen asleep there. Cards were found out on the table next to her, leading to the theory that she'd actually been playing solitaire. Harold and Josephine's dog, a German Shepherd, also died in the fire. Despite initial concerns of foul play, the final investigation concluded that the fire was accidental, with no definitive cause determined. Joan lost both her parents and her home in one day. She lost everything. She was taken in by her maternal aunt and uncle, Alice and Frank Nattrass. They formally adopted her and she took their surname. But her time there was reportedly anything but safe. Years later, Joan revealed that she had been abused by her stepfather, an allegation that Frank denied when questioned by police in 1963. Frank actually passed away in 1970, but his son, Frank Peter Nattrass, has spent decades pursuing answers to Joan's unexplained disappearance and has even written a book, which I do recommend you all read, and I will link in the description. Despite the trauma of Joan's early years, she didn't let it define her future. She went on to Wilson College in Pennsylvania, and by 1952 she had earned a degree in English. After graduation, she worked her way into the publishing world, starting as a secretary before landing a job as an editorial assistant in New York City. Then, in 1954, her life took a quite hopeful turn. At a Harvard football game, she met Martin Risch. Martin was a graduate of Harvard Business School and an executive of Fitchburg Paper Company. Martin was born on October the 7th, 1929, and he was considered kind, responsible and socially well regarded. Joan and Martin quickly became inseparable. 2 years later, they married. Joan stepped away from her career and she moved with Martin to Ridgefield in Connecticut. They started a family there, having 2 children, Lillian and David. By 1961, the Risch family had relocated to Lincoln in Massachusetts. Joan was a full-time mother, but she hadn't lost her love of words. She read avidly and occasionally wrote in her spare time. She also became active in the local League of Women Voters. According to her foster mother, Alice Nattrass, Joan seemed happy. The family had a lovely home, 2 healthy children, and, in Alice's words, they were congenial companions. From the outside, Joan's life looked idyllic. But then came the 24th of October, 1961. 6 months after moving to Lincoln, the Risch home was turned upside down. Joan vanished, and in her place was a blood-stained kitchen and a trail that led to the driveway. Joan herself was nowhere to be found. The day started as usual. Martin left early, just before 7 a.m, to catch a flight to New York for a business trip. That left Joan home with the children. She got Lillian and David up, gave them breakfast, then dropped David off with their neighbour, Barbara Barker, while she took Lillian to a dentist appointment. Afterwards, Joan ran a few errands, she cashed a cheque, and then she did some shopping. By 11 a.m, Joan and Lillian were back home having lunch. At around noon, Joan went to pick up David from Barbara's home and laid him down for his nap. Lillian went to play in Barbara's yard with Barbara's son. According to Barbara Barker, around 1:55 p.m, Joan returned to her own property and was seen carrying a pair of gardening shears. She reportedly went into her backyard, which was typical for her. She often spent time tending to a garden in the afternoons. Barbara noted that Joan had not said anything unusual at the time. She simply assumed Joan was going to do a bit of pruning while the children were playing. At some point, Lillian and Barbara's son had gone over to Joan's home, and at around 2 p.m, Joan brought the children back to Barbara's yard and told them that she'd be back soon, but she didn't say anything to the adults before heading home. At 2:15 p.m, Barbara glanced out of her kitchen window and she saw Joan standing near her car in a trench coat, holding something red in front of her. Barbara assumed that Joan was just playing with the kids. She had no idea that that would be the last confirmed sighting of Joan Risch. At 3:20 p.m, a neighbour's daughter came home from school and noticed an unfamiliar car parked nearby, a dirty blue or grey sedan. 5 minutes later, someone else saw a car reversing out of either the Keane or Risch driveway. But the Keanes, Joan's neighbours, said they had no visitors. At 3:40 p.m, Barbara walked Lillian back home, believing that Joan was still inside. But when Barbara returned at 4:15 p.m, Lillian, who was outside alone, ran over to her saying, "Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered with red paint." It wasn't paint. When Barbara rushed into the house, she found 2-year-old David crying in his crib. The kitchen was a mess. Blood pooled on the floor and splattered across the walls and surfaces. The phone had been ripped from the wall and thrown into the trash, along with an empty spirit bottle and a few beer cans. The scene was chaotic. Blood had dripped upstairs to the bedrooms and even outside to the driveway. There were bloodstains on the family car, on the fender, the hood and the trunk. A bloody handprint on the wall. But strangely, no footprints. Investigators found signs that someone had tried to clean up. Paper towels, rags, and even a pair of David's overalls were blood-stained. The blood loss was estimated at just half a pint, not fatal. And yet, Joan was gone. There was no weapon, no note, no signs of forced entry. Inside, the phone book was open to the emergency numbers page, but no numbers had been written in it. Martin returned home immediately when police reached him in New York. He told investigators that Joan was not the type to leave the children alone, not for any reason. He confirmed the empty spirits bottle had been shared the night before. As for the beer, he wasn't sure. He said they could have been from a party over the weekend. None of it added up. The FBI got involved the very next day. 6 days later, they offered a $500 reward for any information on Joan's whereabouts, but nothing panned out. Around the time she vanished, several people reported seeing a woman matching Joan's description walking along local roads, disoriented, hunched, possibly bleeding. At 2:45 p.m, a woman was seen walking slowly on Route 2A near Lincoln. She wore a grey coat and had a headscarf tied under her chin. At 3:15 p.m, another sighting near Route 128. The woman looked confused, holding something close to her stomach, blood running down her legs. At 4:25 p.m, another sighting, again on Route 128. None of the witnesses stopped to help. So what happened to Joan Risch? Of all the theories surrounding Joan Risch's disappearance, one of the most controversial and most compelling is the idea that she vanished on purpose, that she staged the entire scene, left behind a trail of confusion and blood, and walked away from her life. It sounds far-fetched. A mother of two, living in a peaceful Massachusetts suburb. Why would she do such a thing? And more importantly, how? Well, let's look a bit closer. In the months before she disappeared, Joan had checked out a number of library books. At first glance, nothing unusual, until investigators started looking at the titles. Among them were several crime and mystery books, including one about a woman who fakes her own disappearance. Another involved a kidnapping. One book in particular described how a housewife staged a bloody scene to make it look like she'd been abducted. Was this just coincidence, or was Joan researching? It gets more curious when you consider that Joan had once worked in publishing. She was literate, she was intelligent, and she had a fascination with crime fiction. According to people who knew her, she often read true crime and detective stories. But even more telling, Joan had told at least one person that she was thinking of becoming a teacher or a writer once her children were older. Could her vanishing act have been part of a larger plan? A dramatic attempt to start a new life? Let's weigh up the facts. First, the books. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, and they were checked out not long before she vanished. Second, the scene itself. Investigators noted how strangely controlled it felt, and there was blood, yes, but it was limited. Not enough to suggest a violent death. In fact, the amount lost, about half a pint, was definitely survivable. The blood had been smeared and wiped, not left in a panic. Paper towels had been used to blot the floor. There were no footprints, no signs of a chase or attack. It looked like someone had tried to make it look like a struggle without actually having one. Thirdly, Joan had no known enemies. There was no signs of forced entry. There was no history of mental illness, and according to some accounts, she'd been acting distracted in the days leading up to her disappearance, possibly preoccupied. And then there's her life. To outsiders, the Risches looked like the perfect family. But perfect doesn't always mean happy. Joan had given up a career she loved. She'd gone from an ambitious young editor in New York to a stay-at-home mother in a quiet suburb. In 1961, women had few options, and many who craved more often suffered in silence. Was Joan one of them? Some suggest she may have felt trapped by routine, by motherhood, by the quiet isolation of Ridgefield and then Lincoln. Even Martin, her husband, travelled regularly for work. It's not impossible to imagine her potentially feeling invisible. Could this have been her way out? But for all the intrigue, the staged disappearance theory has some major holes. First, there's no evidence that Joan had a plan. No false identity, no packed bags, no financial preparations. She didn't take her purse or ID. Secondly, if Joan had intended to disappear, then why leave her children behind? She was a devoted mother by all accounts, so it seems unlikely that she would have abandoned David in his crib or traumatised Lillian by letting her discover the scene. Thirdly, the witness sightings don't necessarily help. Yes, several people reported seeing a woman matching Joan's description walking along nearby roads, appearing disoriented and bleeding. But if she was staging a vanishing, why risk being seen like that? Why not make a clean break? Also, if she staged it, where did she go? There were no sightings after that day. No letters, no phone calls. She never reached out to family or friends, not even anonymously. And remember, Martin never changed his number. He waited by the phone for years. Nothing. And lastly, If Joan had escaped, wouldn't she eventually have surfaced, even under another name? But she didn't. So what does it all mean? Was Joan Risch desperate for something more and willing to fake her own disappearance to find it? Was she inspired by the books that she read? Was the blood a diversion, the scene of a performance? Or are we just projecting mystery onto coincidence? The theory is fascinating, but it's also painful, because if it's true, it means Joan chose to leave her life. It means she chose to leave her children behind. And yet, despite all the speculation, there's still no solid evidence, no trail, no trace. Just a woman who vanished in broad daylight, and a theory that years later still can't quite be proven or ruled out. Another theory about Joan Risch's disappearance isn't about crime or escape, but about tragedy. Now, we're going to be talking about a very sensitive topic at this point, and I understand that there are people who have very, very strong opinions on this subject. So I'm going to keep it as factual and respectful as I possibly can. I would just ask that for those of you who may find this triggering or disturbing, you maybe just fast forward the video a little bit, just to ensure that you're looking after yourselves. According to some investigators and researchers, what happened on August the 24th, 1961 may have been the result of a botched home abortion or a sudden medical emergency, like a miscarriage. It's a theory that has circulated for decades, and while it's speculative, some believe it explains the physical evidence better than any other explanation. So let's take a closer look. Start with the blood. There was a significant amount of it, but not a fatal amount. Investigators estimated that Joan had lost about half a pint. That's not nothing, but it's not life-threatening either. The blood was found in multiple places: the kitchen, stairs, the bedrooms, and even on the driveway near the family car. But strangely, there were no bloody footprints, and several spots looked like someone had tried to clean the blood up using paper towels, rags, even a pair of her son's overalls. To some, that clean-up attempt was telling. It didn't look like a sudden violent attack. It looked controlled, like someone who had started to panic, but also tried to manage the situation. Then there's a detail that continues to raise eyebrows. When police examined the Risch home, they noted empty beer bottles and an empty liqueur bottle in the kitchen trash can. Martin Risch explained the liqueur bottle had been shared the night before, but the beer bottles? He had no idea where those came from or why they hadn't been thrown out earlier. According to his own statement, these were not brands that he would normally drink. And he also claimed that he didn't drink beer at home, and Joan was not known to drink alcohol at all. So could the alcohol have been used for pain management? Remember, this was 1961. Abortion was still illegal in most of the United States. It was extremely difficult for women to access safe reproductive care, even in cases of failed pregnancies. Many women turned to underground procedures, unlicensed practitioners, or even attempt to self-manage with limited resources. Could Joan have been taking matters into her own hands? If she experienced complications during a self-induced abortion or suffered a spontaneous miscarriage at home, this could explain the limited but alarming blood, the strange state of the house, and even her disoriented state in the reported sightings afterwards. Several witnesses said they saw the woman matching Joan's description walking along local roads that afternoon, appearing dazed and possibly injured with what looked like blood running down her legs. Was it Joan looking for help and never found it? By the 1950s and early 1960s, it's estimated that 200,000 to 1.2 million illegal abortions occurred every year in the US. According to the Kinsey Institute and various other public health studies, at least 1 in 3 women admitted to knowing someone who had had an illegal abortion. In the 1950s, estimates suggest that more than 5,000 women died each year from complications of illegal abortions. And by 1965, around 17% of all deaths due to pregnancy and childbirth in the US were from these illegal abortions. This procedure wasn't only sought out by unmarried or poor women. Educated, middle-class, married women also sought them, especially if they already had children and couldn't afford more, or the pregnancy was unplanned or high risk, or if their partner didn't support having another child. So in other words, someone like Joan Risch, a mother of two, home alone with no immediate support network, absolutely could have sought a quiet, private abortion, even if it meant going outside official channels. If Joan had indeed been pregnant, she might have avoided a gynecologist for several reasons. There was the fear of exposure. Reporting or admitting an illegal abortion, even to a doctor, could result in criminal charges or losing custody of children. There's the stigma. Even if a doctor was sympathetic, the social shame at that time was immense. It could ruin reputations. There was also no guarantee of help. Many gynecologists refused to help women unless the woman's life was in immediate danger. And so a trusted friend of a friend or nurse performing abortions quietly was sometimes seen as safer or more discreet than the legal system. If Joan did have a back alley or self-induced abortion, her symptoms could have included heavy uterine bleeding, which could have been profuse. She would have experienced abdominal pain or cramping. She could have gone into shock. She could have been disorientated and confused from the blood loss. She could have collapsed or fainted, and ultimately she could have died from hemorrhage or later from sepsis if infection had set in. The scene at Joan's house, moderate blood loss, an attempt to clean up, and sightings of a woman hunched over with blood on her legs could line up with this profile. However, a proper medically supervised abortion, though rare and typically illegal unless life-threatening in those days, would likely not involve any visible bleeding at home and the need for a clean-up or sudden collapse or wandering from the house. That said, even medical abortions in that era did carry higher risks than today's due to the lack of antibiotics or safe surgical environments. For women with no safe options, desperation often turned to danger as they attempted to self-manage their pregnancies. Some used sharp objects, others drank household chemicals. A few turned to the underground providers working without proper tools, training or antiseptics, so the risks were enormous. If Joan had become pregnant and if she feared what that meant, could she have tried to end the pregnancy herself? And if she did it cost her life? A wire coat hanger was found on the roof of Joan's car, and it has long been cited in connection with the botched abortion theory. Wire hangers were a well-known symbol and tool in the era of illegal abortions. They were often used dangerously to self-induce abortion, and many women died or suffered permanent damage attempting this method, especially when done without medical knowledge or sterile conditions. The coat hanger was noted during the initial investigation, but it wasn't treated as suspicious by investigators at the time. The police believed it was likely used for routine purposes like unlocking the car or retrieving keys, especially in a household with children. It's also been speculated that it may have been left there due to having some of Martin's suits dry cleaned. But skeptics argue its presence, alongside the blood evidence, the empty liqueur bottle and apparent attempt at clean-up, should not have been so quickly dismissed, especially given the dangers of illegal abortion at the time. Joan was intelligent, educated, and likely aware of what she was doing. If she attempted to end a pregnancy at home, she may have chosen a method that was known, accessible, and tragically risky. So while the coat hanger was never officially linked to an abortion attempt, its symbolic and historical significance can't be ignored in any serious examination of this theory. Now, this theory doesn't require a mystery car. It doesn't require Joan to fake her own death or run away from her family. It doesn't even assume violence from another person. It just requires something sadly common for the time. A medical emergency that couldn't be handled safely or legally, carried out in secret by a woman who didn't want or couldn't get help. And some say that Joan had been acting slightly off in the days leading up to her disappearance, noting that she seemed a bit distracted. Was she scared? Was she in pain? Was she trying to prepare herself for something? There's also big gaps in this theory because firstly, there's no evidence whatsoever that Joan was pregnant. No one reported it, and she didn't say anything to friends, family, or her doctor. Of course, that doesn't rule it out, but it does mean the theory is largely based on inference. Secondly, if she was planning something medical, why not arrange for help, even in secret? There were no signs that she had reached out to anyone. No medication, no tools, no witnesses to another person in the home, nothing. Thirdly, there's the clean-up. If Joan was hemorrhaging badly, would she have had the strength or clarity to clean up so methodically? Paper towels, rearranged trash cans, no trails leading away from the house. It almost seems too tidy for someone in medical distress. And finally, there's the disappearance itself. Even if she had suffered a miscarriage or a failed abortion, why leave the house altogether? If she was weak, dazed, possibly injured, where did she go and why was she never found? The botched abortion theory offers a heartbreaking possibility that Joan Risch didn't leave willingly and wasn't taken by force, but instead suffered a quiet medical crisis, alone, scared, and unable to reach help. It might explain the blood. It might explain her strange behaviour. It might even explain the last reported sightings of a woman walking slowly down the road, hunched over, possibly bleeding. But what it doesn't explain is what happened next, where Joan went, how she managed to vanish without a trace, and why, after all these years, nothing ever surfaced. No body, no confession, no one ever claiming responsibility. It's a theory that fits part of the picture, but the rest, still missing. For many, the most logical explanation for Joan's disappearance is also the most disturbing, that she was abducted or killed. That what happened on the 24th of October 1961 wasn't staged or self-inflicted, but the result of a violent encounter, either from a stranger or someone she knew. It's one of the earliest theories police considered, and though it's never been proven, there are aspects of the case that point, sometimes quite strongly, in that direction. So let's look at the evidence. The condition of the Risch home raised alarm bells from the very beginning. The overturned furniture, the smeared blood, the open phone book turned to emergency numbers, the kitchen phone ripped from the wall and dumped in the trash. It all looked like something had gone terribly wrong. But what? The trail of blood didn't stop inside the house. It led to the driveway, directly toward the family car. Blood was found on the fender, the hood, and the trunk. This suggested movement, someone or something leaving the house. And then there's the timing. Joan had just returned from errands with her daughter. She'd dropped the children off for playtime at the neighbour's yard. She was due to return shortly, but she never did. Whatever happened occurred in broad daylight in a quiet neighbourhood within a window of just over an hour. That narrow time frame and the boldness of the scene has led many to ask, could someone have entered the house while Joan was home? Could she have been attacked, ambushed by someone who knew she'd be alone? One of the most troubling pieces of evidence came from multiple neighbours who reported seeing the strange car near the Risch property that afternoon, a dirty blue or grey sedan. It was first noticed around 3:20 p.m. by 12-year-old Virginia Keane, the Risch's next-door neighbour. She didn't recognise the car, and her mother later confirmed no one had come to their house. Around the same time, another local resident had to stop their own car to let a vehicle back out of either the Keene or the Risch driveway. A few days earlier, the family's milkman also reported seeing a similar vehicle parked in the Risch driveway during his morning delivery. Whoever owned that car has never been identified. Did someone watch the house? Was Joan being followed? And more importantly, did she know the person who came to her door that day? There were no signs of forced entry. No windows were broken. The door wasn't kicked in. That has led some to believe that Joan may have let someone inside willingly, perhaps even someone she knew. And if this was a premeditated attack, it might not have been random at all. In some corners of the investigation, speculation has persisted that Joan could have been involved in an affair. There's no hard evidence for this, but the idea gained traction after reports of an unfamiliar man seen loitering near her home in the weeks before the disappearance. The FBI would later dismiss that report as unfounded, but others weren't so sure. Could Joan have been meeting someone in secret? Could that meeting have turned violent? Or did she try to end something? And did that decision cost her her life? There's no doubt that something traumatic happened in the Risch home, but whether that trauma was caused by another person is still an open question, because there were no signs of a struggle. There was no smashed dishes, no broken glass, no neighbours heard screaming. Also, none of the blood was found in large, fatal pools. It was spread out, it was spotted, it was smeared. And again, investigators estimated that she only lost about half a pint of blood, which isn't consistent with a deadly assault. There was also no murder weapon left behind and no evidence of Joan's body, ever. If this was a murder, it would have required someone to silently subdue a grown woman in daylight, cleanly remove her from the scene and leave almost nothing behind. It's not impossible, but it's precise. Too precise, and that's what makes this theory both frightening and frustrating. Joan may have been taken by force. She may have been murdered. The trail of blood, the strange car, the open emergency number pages, they all hint at something sinister behind closed doors. But if she was killed, where is her body? If she was abducted, why was there no ransom, no demands, no sightings? The Lincoln police and even the FBI never charged anyone. No suspect has ever been named, and no one has confessed. It remains to this day a crime without a witness. Whether Joan was the victim of a planned attack or a sudden random act of violence, I feel like we might never know. And perhaps what's most disturbing is this. If it was a murder, the person who did it may have walked away clean and may have stayed that way for over 60 years. In the years following Joan's disappearance, another unsettling theory began to circulate, quietly but persistently. Some believed that Joan was silenced by the very man who raised her adoptive father, Frank Nattrass. According to Martin Risch, Joan once confided, just once, that Frank had actually abused her during her youth. She didn't go into detail and she never brought it up again. But what if someone else knew? What if word got back to Frank and he feared exposure? Could he have driven over 200 miles to Lincoln, killed Joan, and staged the scene to look like a bizarre disappearance? The idea is definitely both interesting and concerning. There was no proof he was in Massachusetts. There was no eyewitnesses. There's nothing tangible that we can really cling on to. This theory is often raised in true crime forums. It's popular on websites such as Web Sleuths, but it is heavily debated. And while it is based on a real allegation that Joan made, there's no official suspicion or indictment, and many consider it speculative or even defamatory without further proof. So we do just need to remember that Frank Nattrass is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, as frustrating as that may be. Among the more obscure but persistent theories in the disappearance of Joan is one that doesn't come from crime fiction, medical emergencies, or mysterious strangers, but from something far more mundane: land acquisition. At the centre of this theory is a man called Robert Foster, who was a purchasing agent for the National Park Service. In the early 1960s, Foster was tasked with acquiring residential properties in and around Lincoln, Massachusetts, including the very area where the Risch family lived, for a federal historic preservation project. The government had plans to expand the Minuteman National Historical Park, a large-scale initiative that was aimed at protecting Revolutionary War sites across Massachusetts. To do that, they needed land, lots of it, including, eventually, the Risch property. The theory is that Joan or Martin may have been resisting the sale of their property to the federal government, and that someone possibly under pressure to acquire that land may have tried to coerce or intimidate the family into compliance. That Joan's disappearance may have been meant as a message. According to one version of the story, Robert Foster had been in contact with several homeowners in the area who were reluctant to sell, and some allegedly had expressed discomfort with his persistence. There's no public record of any formal conflict between Foster and the Risches, but some researchers have suggested that Joan's home and her sudden vanishing might have been connected to federal interest in the land. In 1975, long after Joan disappeared, the National Park Service did purchase the Risch home, eventually relocating it to nearby Lexington. So, was the pressure to sell present even in 1961? And if so, how far would someone go to push a family off their land? There are a few reasons why this theory has stayed alive, especially in local circles and online discussions. First, there's the timing. Joan disappeared in 1961, and the government began the process of acquiring land for the Minuteman Park in 1959. By the early 1960s, it was full steam ahead. Secondly, Robert Foster's name has come up more than once in relation to other tense negotiations with homeowners in the area. While there's no direct evidence linking him to misconduct, some residents did reportedly find his approach overly persistent, and they felt very uncomfortable with him. And thirdly, if someone wanted to threaten a family into leaving or remove a perceived obstacle, it would have to be done in a way that didn't immediately look like a targeted act. Joan's disappearance was confusing. There were no suspects, no demands, no ransom. If it was meant to frighten someone into cooperation, it worked without needing to be explained. But this theory also faces major hurdles, because first and foremost, there's no hard evidence tying Robert Foster to the disappearance. There was no documents, no witnesses, no motive that's ever been confirmed. He was never named a suspect by law enforcement, and he did actually provide an alibi when questioned, which was backed up by some of his co-workers. Secondly, Martin Risch never reported any conflict with the National Park Service. In fact, after Joan's disappearance, he remained in that home for over a decade. If he believed that her vanishing had anything to do with the government, he never said so publicly. Thirdly, the timeline is quite murky. While the Park Service was indeed acquiring land during that period, there is no indication that they were actively pursuing the Risch property at the time Joan vanished. That didn't come until years later. And finally, there's the question of motive. If this was intimidation, it was an extreme form of it. Joan wasn't just frightened, she disappeared entirely, and there was never any follow-up threat. Nothing sent to Martin, no warnings, no demands, just silence. The Robert Foster theory presents a quite chilling possibility that Joan was caught up in something far larger than herself. A government expansion effort, a pressure campaign, a power imbalance that spiralled. It's a theory that taps into our fears of the bureaucratic machine, of powerful people making others disappear simply to achieve a goal. But in the end, it remains just that, a theory, unproven, unconfirmed, and unlikely to ever be verified. Robert Foster died decades ago. The Minuteman Park did eventually expand, and Joan Risch's home was removed from its original foundation and placed elsewhere. But whether that move was related to her disappearance or just part of history moving on, we may never know. Some believe Joan didn't run away and she wasn't murdered and there was no medical issue that contributed to her going missing. Some believe in the military base theory. Just a few miles from her quiet Lincoln neighbourhood lies Hanscom Air Force Base. In 1961, it was already a critical node in America's Cold War defence system. And some surmise that Joan could have been linked to something bigger, something that we're not meant to understand. She'd been reading about disappearances. Her house bore signs of a staged struggle. But is that enough to suggest federal involvement? Hanscom Air Force Base, a highly secure military facility with intelligence ties even in the 1960s, was only a short drive from Joan's home. And there were no signs of forced entry or meaningful evidence left behind in her property, which suggests a controlled exit rather than a chaotic crime. Government extractions tend to be clean and deliberate. As we know, Joan had recently checked out books on missing persons, disappearances and faked abductions from the local library, which could indicate preparation or research, possibly for a planned exit. Despite the national coverage early on, the case quickly quieted, and some say it quietened down far too quickly for such a bizarre case involving a well-educated suburban mother, and this has led to suspicions of government suppression or classified involvement. Because she was a well-educated, literate woman with professional publishing experience, some theorists speculate that she might have had contact with intelligence services through her publishing work in New York or via her adoptive father if he had military ties. Even 60 years later, no remains or verified sightings have surfaced and the crime scene looked partly staged, which gives some the impression that someone carefully orchestrated the disappearance and that someone was from the military base. There's a lot of holes in this theory as well. There's no public record of Joan ever working with or for the government or the military, nor of any relatives in such roles. Her life seemed suburban and private. No sightings, records, or whistleblowers have ever confirmed movement towards or on Hanscom Air Force Base. A base log or surveillance breach would be highly risky. Joan appeared to be close to her family and her husband. Friends say that she was loving and attentive. It's hard to imagine her abandoning a family without a strong personal reason. The main one is that this wasn't the right era, really, for that kind of operation. In 1961, there were no known cases of average citizens being covertly disappeared into military custody. Most Cold War intelligence operations focused on overseas targets or espionage threats, not suburban housewives. And military-involved cases often come with sealed files or heavy suppression. The Risch case remained open and unsolved, not classified or removed from public record. This particular theory doesn't seem to hold a lot of weight, but when a person vanishes without a trace, we're often left to wonder, was it a crime or a cover-up? One of the enduring theories about Joan's disappearance is that after tending to a garden, she may have wandered away into the woods, either by choice or by force. Her backyard bordered dense woodland, a place where she might have gone to prune branches, gather plants, or maybe even simply clear her mind. It wasn't unusual for Joan to spend time outside like this, but the woods were also remote, easy to get lost in, and far from immediate help. If Joan did venture into the forest, several grim possibilities arise. She might have suffered an accident, collapsing or injuring herself beyond the help of her children, or perhaps she encountered someone with violent intent, an intruder or stranger lurking nearby. The police searched the area extensively, even using bloodhounds, but found no trace of Joan or the gardening shears she'd earlier been seen carrying. Those shears were never recovered anywhere. The absence of evidence in the woods does add to the mystery. Did she leave the house willingly or was she forced? Did she disappear into the trees or was she taken away from there? The theory paints a really sad and disturbing picture of a woman alone in the woods, vulnerable and invisible. And that really underscores the terrifying reality that safety is actually never guaranteed, even in a quiet suburban town. But there are reasons to question this theory. First, the thorough search efforts came up empty. There was no sign of Joan or her belongings in the woods. Secondly, it seems really unlikely that Joan would leave two young children alone at home to wander off into a dense forest, especially while potentially carrying gardening shears. Thirdly, the blood evidence found mostly inside the house suggests that the struggle or injury occurred indoors, not outside. And finally, no witnesses reported seeing Joan enter the woods or hearing any distress signals nearby. Taken together, these factors suggest that the woods theory, while plausible, doesn't fully align with the physical evidence or circumstances. Another perspective that some have explored is Joan's state of mind leading up to her disappearance. Though those closest to her described Joan as a devoted mother and an active community member, some suggest that she might have been struggling privately with anxiety, depression, or overwhelming stress. The pressures of maintaining the ideal suburban family life, coping with past trauma, and raising young children can take a toll, even on those who seem perfectly composed. Joan's interest in books about disappearances and crime has been interpreted by some as a sign that she was preoccupied with escape or even planning to vanish. While there is no direct evidence that she was mentally unwell, it is worth considering how mental health struggles might have influenced her actions that day. Could she have left the house voluntarily, disoriented or desperate, seeking solitude or relief? Or might she have experienced a brief episode of confusion or amnesia? The mental health theory doesn't offer answers, but it does remind us that people's internal battles are often invisible and highly complex. In the end, Joan's disappearance may have involved more than just physical factors. It may have also reflected a silent struggle with her mind and emotions. But while the mental health theory offers one possible explanation, there are several reasons to be really cautious about accepting it without question. Those who knew Joan described her as stable and capable. Friends, neighbours and family remembered her as caring, engaged and grounded, someone who managed her responsibilities well. Yes, her struggle may have been internal and may not have been witnessed, but for these descriptions to be persistent and consistent, with nobody saying that they ever saw her appearing down in the dumps or stressed, does make you think that mental health struggles may not have been a factor. On the day that she vanished, Joan was seen interacting normally. She was taking care of her children. She went to a dentist appointment. She went out shopping and then she tended to a garden. So these actions suggest that she was functioning at that point without obvious distress. There was no note left to say that she wanted to take her life. There was no clear indication of intent. And unlike many cases involving mental health crises, there were no signs of prior episodes or hospitalisations. Focusing too heavily on mental health does risk unfairly blaming Joan for her own disappearance, something that can overshadow other, more tangible explanations. In the end, while it's important to consider all angles, the mental health theory alone doesn't fully explain the mysterious events of that day. This was a strange case. There were leads, but nothing ever stuck. We also have to take a look at the witnesses that claim to have seen Joan. Between 2:45 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. on October the 24th, the day that Joan vanished, at least 3 different witnesses said they saw a woman resembling Joan in various locations, a few miles from her home, and said that she was wearing a grey or light trench coat. She had a headscarf over her head and tied under her chin. She appeared to be injured or unwell. She was either shuffling or hunched over or clutching her abdomen, and in some cases blood was seen running down her legs. The locations varied and were given as Route 2A near Lincoln, which is approximately 200 yards from the Risch home, and Route 128 near Waltham and Trapello Road, several miles away. Surprisingly, the witnesses were fairly consistent in describing the court, the gait, which was slow or shuffling, the scarf tied under the chin, and her body language, which was suggesting pain or distress, clutching at her stomach. This uniformity has often been used to argue that they did likely see the same person and that that person must have been Joan. But are these witnesses reliable? Not entirely. We need to be cautious. It is good that multiple independent witnesses gave matching descriptions. They all saw the woman around the same general time period, and descriptions of her behaviour were odd but not fantastical, so nobody was exaggerating. But nobody knew Joan personally. None of the witnesses knew Joan by face, only from photos seen later. Identifying a stranger based on a black and white newspaper photo is notoriously unreliable, especially when seeing someone only briefly. There was no direct interaction between the witnesses and the lady seen walking in distress. Nobody stopped to help the woman, to speak to her, or to confirm her identity. And this removes the ability to confirm mannerisms, voice, or actual facial recognition. Memory issues come into play because these accounts were given after news of Joan's disappearance broke, meaning that the witness memory might have been contaminated by media coverage. In high-profile cases, people might remember things that fit what they read or what they heard, and the time and distance just doesn't quite add up. Some sightings were miles away. If Joan was severely injured and losing blood, it's questionable how she could walk that far unaided in such a short period of time. Now, psychological research on eyewitness memory shows that eyewitnesses tend to be better at describing clothing and movement than faces, and that they're prone to filling in gaps with assumptions. They're also influenced by leading questions and news reports and that desire to be helpful. In many cases, what appears to be multiple identical sightings might be the same woman seen multiple times, not necessarily Joan, or different women entirely retroactively fitted to the case. When Joan disappeared in October 1961, the Lincoln Police Department responded promptly to the emergency call. Sergeant McHugh was among the first officers on the scene, arriving within minutes of the distress report. They quickly secured the Risch home and began documenting the blood evidence. Blood spatters were found on the stairs, the children's bedrooms, and even the driveway leading to Joan's car. Investigators meticulously collected fingerprints, including a distinctive left thumbprint found next to the telephone mount. Despite processing over 5,000 sets of prints, none matched Joan or any known suspect. Of course, they couldn't match prints to Joan because she'd disappeared. The police also interviewed neighbours and friends extensively, attempting to piece together a timeline of Joan's last movements. They canvassed the neighbourhood for witnesses, tracking reported sightings of a woman matching Joan's description in nearby towns. Additionally, a search of the surrounding woods was organised involving both volunteers and trained bloodhounds. Despite their best efforts, the search yielded no clues. Lincoln Police Chief Leo Algio described the case as sort of a stone around my neck. Even after retiring in 1970, he continued to revisit the mystery, stating in an interview with the Boston Globe, "I thought they'd find a body or bones or something. People don't disappear without a trace." Despite the police's dedication, the tools available to them at the time were limited. There was no DNA testing, which today often provides breakthroughs in cold cases. Fingerprint analysis was manual and slow, and there was no centralised database to cross-check prints efficiently. There were no surveillance cameras, no mobile phones, no digital footprints to trace. Phones were landlines, and the Risch phone itself had been ripped from the wall, which destroyed any potential for call logs or clues. In contrast, today's investigations leverage a range of advanced forensic technologies. DNA analysis can identify victims or suspects from trace evidence. Mobile phone data can map a person's movements. Surveillance cameras cover many public spaces, and digital records offer timelines that were just unimaginable in 1961. Had Joan's disappearance happened today, these tools might have yielded new evidence or at least narrowed the search. But it's still really important to acknowledge the thoroughness of the original investigation. For their era, the Lincoln police worked diligently and with determination to solve the case, despite the many obstacles they faced. Among the many puzzling details of the Risch home was the state of that telephone. The phone had been ripped from the wall, a violent and deliberate act, and tossed into a trash bin. But this wasn't just any bin. It had been removed from its usual spot under the sink to the middle of the kitchen floor. Inside the bin, along with a broken phone, the police found the empty liqueur bottle and several beer bottles. The disarray obviously raised immediate questions. Was someone trying to disrupt communication, or was it an angry outburst? Nearby, the family's address book lay open on a table and its pages were flipped to emergency numbers, but none had been entered. It's important to remember, in 1961, there was no 999. Instead, a lot of families memorised or kept handy a list of local police, fire and ambulance numbers, and I'm not too sure if at the time actually you could have punched in the number 0 and been connected to an operator who would have given you numbers for the local departments. Anybody who knows that information, who lived in that area or has family members that remember the 60s, please do let me know in the comments. Was calling the number 0 a thing to get an operator back then, or did that come in later? The open address book might, of course, suggest that someone was trying to call for help or was interrupted while looking for a number, and several theories have been proposed to explain these strange details. Some obviously suggesting that a struggle took place in the kitchen, the phone was torn off the wall in the heat of the moment, perhaps during attack or confrontation. Others believe the displaced trash bin and open address book was staged, either by Joan herself in an attempt to signal distress, or by someone else trying to confuse investigators. Another possibility is that these signs point to a break-in or domestic disturbance where the intruder disabled the phone to prevent calls for help. But whatever the truth, the phone, the trash bin and the emergency numbers remain quite disturbing clues, symbols of desperation, confusion or violence, but their exact meaning has never been uncovered. One of the most strange aspects of Joan's case was the presence of blood, not just in the kitchen but scattered throughout the house. The investigators found blood spots on the stairs leading to the second floor, inside the master bedroom and even in the children's bedrooms. So this could suggest a struggle or injury that wasn't confined to a single area. This could have been movement through the home, a desperate path traced in blood. The trail didn't stop inside the house, it continued outside, across the driveway and even onto the family's car parked nearby. Blood was found on the car's right rear fender, the left side of the hood and the centre of the trunk. And this striking detail does raise questions. Was Joan trying to escape? Was she dragged outside? Did the struggle spill out onto the driveway? The blood pattern, combined with the lack of bloody footprints, suggested that somebody might have tried to clean up or cover the evidence using the towels or rags, including Joan's son's overalls. And theories abound about the blood evidence. Did Joan sustain a superficial wound but manage to get to her car? Was there a struggle near the vehicle? Or was the blood placed there to mislead investigators? No weapon was ever found, and the mystery of the blood trail remains one of the case's most bizarre, unsolved puzzles. But while much speculation surrounds the blood found throughout the Risch home, it is important to consider natural medical reasons that might explain it. And one common cause of unexplained bleeding is trauma from a fall. If Joan suffered a fall, perhaps while tending a garden or moving through the house, she could have sustained a head injury. The scalp is richly supplied with blood vessels, and even a minor bump can cause significant bleeding. Such wounds do tend to bleed heavily, but may not be life-threatening if treated promptly. If she fell and injured her head, it could explain blood on the stairs and multiple rooms if she was trying to move around or get help. Another possibility is a severe nosebleed. Certain conditions like high blood pressure or fragile nasal blood vessels can cause heavy nosebleeds. If Joan experienced a sudden, severe nosebleed, blood could have dripped onto various surfaces, potentially explaining some of the splatters. However, nosebleeds typically result in blood mainly around the face and hands rather than large blood pools. But maybe if she'd been in the kitchen and she just leaned forward, then the blood could easily have gushed to the floor. While miscarriage is one possibility, heavy menstrual bleeding or other uterine conditions like fibroids or infections can also cause significant blood loss. These would likely result in blood on clothing or furniture. Less commonly, disorders like haemophilia or other clotting disorders can cause spontaneous bleeding, but there's no record suggesting that Joan had such a condition. Without a body or further medical evidence, these natural explanations remain speculative, but they are all plausible. The discussion around Joan's disappearance is still very much alive, especially online. Search Joan's name today and you'll find countless Reddit threads, message boards, YouTube comments, Facebook groups and amateur sleuth forums, all trying to solve the mystery. But while some people approach the case with curiosity and empathy, others dive in with strong opinions and little patience for disagreement. Theories become battle lines. Some are convinced Joan ran away. Others believe she was murdered. A few argue that she never left the house at all. And those conversations, at times, can get surprisingly heated. The staged disappearance camp often clashes with those who believe she was abducted. One side points to the library books, the cleaned-up crime scene, and the idea of a woman quietly orchestrating her escape. The other side sees that as absurd or even victim-blaming, arguing that Joan would never abandon her children and that something sinister must have happened to her. Meanwhile, any mention of abortion or miscarriage tends to divide people sharply. Some see it as a plausible and tragic explanation. Others find it speculative or even offensive, especially with no proof that Joan was pregnant. Even Robert Foster's name, when it comes up, can ignite intense debate, some accusing others of reaching for conspiracy, while others insist the land development angle has been unfairly ignored. In many ways, it's no longer just about Joan Risch. It becomes about how people see the world and how much certainty they demand from an uncertain story. Now, it's not unusual for people to grow emotionally attached to a theory. For some, it's about justice. For others, it's about feeling like they've figured something out that others have missed. But in the age of online forums, that passion sometimes turns personal. Accusations fly. People accuse others of being willfully blind, irresponsible, or even dangerous. A disagreement about evidence becomes a full-blown argument about morality, feminism, trauma, or the way the media frames missing women. It becomes easy to forget that behind all these discussions was a real person. Joan Risch. A mother, a wife, a woman with dreams, friends, and a life cut short, one way or another. She didn't ask to become a case or a debate. The truth is, we still don't know what happened to Joan, and maybe we never will. And that's a hard thing to sit with, especially in a world that thrives on conclusions. But not every story can be neatly solved. Not every clue fits the puzzle. And perhaps the most respectful thing that we can do, whether we believe in a staged disappearance, a botched abortion, or a murder, is to discuss it with openness, not certainty. with empathy, not ego. And to remember that every theory is not just a line of logic, it's a reflection of how we see the world. But that doesn't make someone else's view the enemy. It just makes the mystery human. In January 1962, a Boston newspaper offered a $5,000 reward and ran a multi-page timeline of Joan's last known day. No new tips emerged. Martin never gave up hope. He stayed in the same home, raised Lillian and David on his own, and he never remarried. He never declared Joan legally dead. He kept the same phone number, just in case she called. He believed, until the day he died in 2009, that Joan might come back, that maybe she lost her memory and would one day remember who she was, but she never returned. Chief Leo Algio, who investigated the case from the beginning, said people don't disappear without a trace. But Joan did, and when Leo Algio passed away in 2009, the last of the original investigators was gone. Joan Risch disappeared over 6 decades ago, leaving behind blood, confusion and silence. No note, no confirmed sighting, no known motive, just 2 children alone in their home and a trail that seemed to lead to nowhere. What we've been left with isn't just a crime, but a mirror of how society viewed women in the 1960s. A reminder that beneath even the most ordinary lives, something unknown can be brewing, and a warning that sometimes the world doesn't give us closure. It just moves on. Joan's case has become a cornerstone for amateur sleuths and true crime communities. From Reddit threads to podcast breakdowns, thousands of people still revisit the evidence, challenge the theories, and try to trace her final steps. But even here, even now, we see how polarised these conversations can become, and it gets heated. Theories turn into battles, facts into assumptions. People pick sides, as if truth could be voted on. But in the end, Joan wasn't a character in a novel. She was a real woman, a mother, a daughter, a survivor of childhood trauma. Whatever happened to her that day, it's worth remembering that she didn't vanish from a story. She vanished from her life. And maybe that's the real lesson here. That in the world of true crime, it's not always about solving the mystery. Sometimes it's just about recognising the human being at the heart of it. And somewhere, her son, David, still holds on to that quiet belief that maybe his mother is in heaven. Joan Risch has never been found, but she's never been forgotten. And maybe that's something. I've been Fiona, and this has been Case Continued.